Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Have you noticed something interesting about American politics lately? For years, every election seemed to revolve around the same handful of issues: immigration, inflation, abortion, crime, taxes. Every campaign looked like another version of the last one. But recently, another issue has started creeping into the national conversation. It's not as emotionally charged as immigration. It doesn't dominate cable news every night. Yet it may end up becoming one of the most important political weapons either party has. That issue is government fraud. Not just corruption in the traditional sense, but the idea that billions of taxpayer dollars are disappearing into programs that were never properly supervised. Money meant for children, for healthcare, for food assistance, or for public services ending up in the hands of criminals while government officials either looked the other way or failed to stop it. For Republicans, this isn't simply about exposing another scandal. Increasingly, it looks like they're trying to build an entire political identity around the issue. And if that's true, then Vice President JD Vance may be positioning himself to become the face of that strategy. Now, before we go any further, it's important to separate two different questions. The first question is whether every allegation in these investigations will ultimately be proven in court. That's a legal process, and it takes time. The second question is political. Whether or not these investigations eventually produce criminal convictions, Republicans appear convinced that government accountability is becoming a winning issue with voters. That distinction matters, because politics isn't only about what happens inside a courtroom. It's also about what voters believe Washington should prioritize. One case that's received increasing attention involves Minnesota. Federal investigators, congressional committees, and state officials have spent years examining allegations involving fraud connected to public assistance programs. The most famous example was the Feeding Our Future scandal, where prosecutors alleged that hundreds of millions of dollars intended to feed children during the pandemic were instead diverted through a network of fraudulent organizations. The case shocked people not simply because of the amount of money involved, but because investigators argued that warning signs had existed for years. Republicans argue that the scandal exposed a much larger problem. They claim government agencies often focus on expanding programs without building systems capable of preventing abuse. Democrats, on the other hand, generally respond that fraud should absolutely be prosecuted, but isolated scandals shouldn't become excuses to dismantle programs that millions of honest Americans rely on. That's a legitimate debate. But what's fascinating isn't only the policy disagreement. It's how Republicans have started talking about it. Notice the language. Instead of simply saying they want smaller government, they're increasingly saying they want a government that actually works. That's a very different message. For decades, one of the biggest criticisms Democrats made against Republicans was that Republicans simply wanted to cut programs, cut spending, cut regulations, cut taxes. That argument worked with many voters because it raised an obvious question. If government gets smaller, what happens to people who genuinely need help? Now, Republicans appear to be reframing the conversation. Instead of saying, "We're cutting benefits," they're saying, "We're protecting taxpayers from fraud." That's politically much stronger. After all, very few Americans support welfare fraud. Very few Americans believe taxpayer money should disappear into fake nonprofits or criminal organizations. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or independent, most people agree that if public money is being stolen, someone should be held accountable. That creates something increasingly rare in modern politics: a message capable of attracting voters outside one party's base. Independent voters may disagree about immigration. They may disagree about abortion. They may disagree about climate policy. But they usually don't disagree about prosecuting fraud. And that's exactly why this issue deserves attention. If Republicans successfully frame themselves not as the party of spending cuts, but as the party of government accountability, they may be changing the political battlefield altogether. Think about how Donald Trump built his political identity. For years, border security became almost synonymous with Trump himself. Whether people agreed with him or opposed him, they knew exactly what issue he represented. Political branding matters. Every successful national politician eventually becomes associated with one or two defining issues. Ronald Reagan became associated with tax cuts and confronting the Soviet Union. Bill Clinton became associated with balancing the federal budget while embracing economic growth. Trump became associated with immigration and border enforcement. The question now is whether JD Vance is beginning to build his own political identity around government efficiency, accountability, and fraud prevention. That doesn't happen overnight. But political brands are built one story at a time. One investigation, one hearing, one press conference, one report after another. If voters repeatedly see Vance announcing investigations, recovering taxpayer money, supporting oversight, and arguing for stronger accountability, those separate events eventually merge into a single public image. Whether fair or unfair, politics often works through repetition. And Republicans understand that. There's another reason this strategy may be attractive. Americans have become increasingly skeptical of large institutions. Trust in Congress remains historically low. Confidence in many federal agencies has declined. Even public trust in major media organizations has fallen over the past decade. Against that backdrop, arguing that government needs stronger oversight may resonate with voters who already believe Washington wastes too much money. Importantly, this message doesn't necessarily require convincing voters that every government program is bad. It only requires convincing them that government should be responsible with the money it already spends. That's a much easier argument to make. And it may explain why Republicans are investing so much political energy into investigations involving public spending. Of course, none of this guarantees political success. There's an important difference between launching investigations and producing meaningful results. If investigations uncover significant wrongdoing, recover taxpayer funds, and lead to real reforms, Republicans could point to tangible accomplishments rather than campaign promises. But if investigations appear overly partisan or fail to produce convincing evidence, the strategy could easily backfire. American voters have seen enough congressional investigations over the years to know that not every dramatic hearing changes public opinion. Many simply disappear from the headlines. The challenge, therefore, isn't merely opening investigations. It's convincing the public that those investigations matter. Here's where things get even more interesting. Because this isn't really just about Minnesota, Republicans are increasingly trying to connect a series of separate stories into one larger narrative. Whether it's pandemic relief fraud, unemployment insurance fraud, Medicaid abuse, improper payments, or concerns about how taxpayer dollars are distributed through nonprofit organizations, the message is remarkably consistent. They're asking voters one simple question. If Washington can't even keep track of the money it's already spending, why should taxpayers trust it with even more? That's an argument that extends far beyond one state or one investigation. It speaks to a broader concern that's been growing for years. According to surveys, Americans across the political spectrum believe government wastes a significant amount of taxpayer money. They may disagree on exactly how much or which programs are most affected, but frustration over government inefficiency isn't confined to conservatives. That gives Republicans an opportunity. Instead of framing every election as a fight over ideology, they can frame it as a question of competence. And competence is often a much stronger political message. Think about it from the perspective of an independent voter. That voter may not identify as conservative. They may even support social welfare programs in principle. But if they hear that hundreds of millions of dollars intended for children were allegedly stolen because government agencies ignored warning signs, they're probably not asking whether welfare programs should exist. They're asking a much simpler question. How could this happen? That's a powerful emotional reaction. People generally don't mind helping those in need. They do mind feeling that their tax dollars are being wasted. And once that perception takes hold, it becomes very difficult for any administration to defend itself. This is where JD Vance could play an important role. Throughout his political career, Vance has often argued that government should focus less on expanding its reach and more on delivering results. That philosophy fits naturally with an anti-fraud message. Instead of arguing against every government program, he can argue that government has a responsibility to prove it can manage existing programs responsibly before asking taxpayers to fund new ones. That's a position that may appeal not only to traditional Republicans, but also to fiscal conservatives, moderates, and even some Democrats who are frustrated with bureaucratic inefficiency. Of course, Democrats aren't without responses of their own. One obvious argument is that fraud exists in every large system. Private companies experience fraud. Banks experience fraud. Insurance companies experience fraud. The existence of fraud, they would argue, doesn't mean the underlying program should disappear. Instead, it means oversight should improve. That's an important distinction. Democrats could also argue that Republicans are selectively highlighting cases involving Democratic-led states while paying less attention to problems elsewhere. If voters begin to see investigations as politically motivated rather than fact-driven, Republicans could lose some of the credibility they're trying to build. That's why evidence matters. The stronger the evidence, the stronger the political message. The weaker the evidence, the easier it becomes for opponents to dismiss the entire effort as partisan theater. History offers plenty of examples of both outcomes. Some investigations permanently changed American politics. Others generated enormous headlines before quietly fading away. So it's far too early to predict where the current investigations will ultimately fall. But politically speaking, Republicans don't necessarily need every investigation to produce blockbuster headlines. They simply need to reinforce a consistent message over time. Political branding is built through repetition. If voters repeatedly hear phrases like government accountability, protecting taxpayers, stopping waste, and preventing fraud, those ideas eventually become associated with the politicians delivering them. That's how successful political narratives are constructed. Not through one speech, not through one television interview, but through hundreds of small moments that gradually reinforce the same story. This may also explain why Republicans have increasingly embraced the language of government efficiency. A few years ago, much of the conservative message focused on limiting government. Today, the emphasis sounds different. It's less about shrinking government for its own sake and more about making government accountable to taxpayers. Those ideas aren't identical. One is ideological. The other is managerial. And that distinction may prove important in future elections. Many Americans aren't looking for ideological purity. They're looking for competence. They want roads repaired, borders secured, public services delivered effectively, tax dollars spent responsibly. If a politician can convince voters they're better at managing government, even without dramatically reducing its size, that can become a significant electoral advantage. Which brings us back to JD Vance. Some political analysts still view him primarily through the lens of cultural issues. Others see him as one of the leading voices of economic populism within the Republican Party. But if the current trend continues, another identity could emerge. The politician who made government accountability his signature issue. Will that happen? No one knows. Politics has a way of changing unexpectedly. Economic conditions shift. International crises emerge. New issues dominate the headlines. By 2028, voters may be talking about entirely different priorities. That's why any prediction today should be made cautiously. Still, the strategy itself is worth paying attention to, because it reflects a broader evolution inside the Republican Party. For decades, Republicans often argued that government was too large. Increasingly, they're making a slightly different argument. They're saying government has become too inefficient. That's a subtle shift, but politically, it could be a meaningful one. Instead of asking Americans to support smaller government as an abstract principle, they're asking a practical question. Should taxpayers expect the government to spend their money responsibly? That's a question that doesn't fit neatly into partisan categories. It's a question that many Americans, regardless of political affiliation, would likely answer with a simple yes. And that may be exactly why Republicans believe this issue has so much potential. Whether that potential ultimately translates into electoral success will depend on several factors. Can investigators produce convincing evidence? Can reforms demonstrate measurable results? Can Republicans maintain public trust by applying the same standards consistently? And can Democrats offer an alternative vision that reassures voters without appearing indifferent to government waste? Those questions remain unanswered. But one thing seems increasingly clear. The conversation is changing. The next phase of American politics may not be defined only by debates over immigration, taxes, or cultural issues. It may also be shaped by a much more practical question. Who can convince Americans that they will protect the taxpayers' money? If Republicans succeed in owning that message, and if JD Vance becomes the politician most closely associated with it, we may look back on these investigations not simply as isolated news stories, but as the beginning of an entirely new political strategy. Whether that strategy succeeds is something only future elections can answer. But it's a story that's just beginning, and it's one worth watching closely. Thanks for watching.